evening and welcome to I24 News Defense. I'm Alon Ben David with your weekly review of security, intelligence and strategic affairs. In this edition, we'll take you from Jerusalem, the continuing flashpoint of terror and unrest, to behind the American policy reversal in Afghanistan, and the appetite for arms in the Gulf, growing since the nuclear deal with Iran. The week in Israel and the West Bank has been a familiar one, with daily stabbing attacks targeting Israelis and a deadly shooting in the southern city of Beersheba. It has also seen daily and often violent protests in the West Bank and the rare deployment of 300 Israeli soldiers into the streets of Jerusalem. Joining me tonight are Barbara Opall, Bureau Chief of Defense News, and Barak, Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security. Before we'll start the discussion, here's a look at recent events. Okay, so clearly what we're seeing here is a new situation and something that won't go away so fast. Barak, what part of it is Palestinian nationalism and what part is inspired by radical Islam?
I think that Islamism has overtaken Palestinian nationalism a long time ago. The very fact that you have, on one hand, Abbas that is inciting, creating the myth about Israeli intervention on the Temple Mount, and at the same time you have the Islamic movement within Israel also stirring up tensions. That both feeds into ISIS' narrative, and ISIS has recently had a whole media campaign with multiple videos exhorting more attacks in Israel. Until now, they've not really been doing that. But
that was the first time that they mentioned Israel as a target.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's no doubt that Israeli Arabs, as well as Palestinians, are increasingly tapping into regional Islamism. When you have somebody like Alen that says that the problem is due to socioeconomic factors, if you look at all the attackers, they've all come from middle-class backgrounds. Same with al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS. He has a PhD. Zawahiri was a doctor. The 9/11 attackers were all upper middle-class backgrounds. So it's quite intellectually lazy or dishonest to attribute this to socioeconomic factors. And Israel does not know how to contend with irrational ideological zero-sum game extremism.
So now, Barbara, after 3 weeks, bloody weeks of 8 Israeli casualties, 30+ Palestinians killed, we see the world trying to intervene. You and Secretary General comes here, Secretary of State meet with the Prime Minister. What are the chances that would produce anything that would chill the atmosphere?
The chances are high that at least they can tamp down the flames to reach some kind of a situation where Palestinians would have some type of a horizon and Israelis would have a return of their sense of security is a real long shot. But I wouldn't sideline the issue of nationalism. I mean, we all knew what was going to happen when the collapse of the Kerry-led peace talks happened in April. And now, as Barak was saying, the Islamists and the extremists are filling in this vacuum. The ground is bubbling. It's on fire, and there must be some type of adult supervision, and the world needs to pay more attention, because right now the two sides are just entrenched in this self-righteousness and sticking to this narrative, and perhaps this international attention will open eyes on both sides.
All right, so let's have a look beyond the horizon to Afghanistan. On a trip to Afghanistan in 2012, US President Barack Obama declared the light of a new day on the horizon, but that new day now seems all too familiar. with the resurgent Taliban back in control of much of the country and a decision to keep American troops there through 2017. Correspondent Michal Divon has the details.
President Barack Obama announced on Thursday a reversal of policy in Afghanistan, slowing plans to fully withdraw U.S. troops and instead maintain a force of 9,800 through most of 2016.
I believe this mission is vital to our national security interests in preventing terrorist attacks against our citizens and our nation.
The decision prolongs the U.S. role in the 14-year-old Afghan war and extends American involvement in the conflict, handing it over to the next elected U.S. president.
The bottom line is, in key areas of the country, the security situation is still very fragile, and in some places, there's risk of deterioration. Fortunately, in President Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah, there is a national unity government that supports a strong partnership with the United States.
President Obama had aimed to withdraw all but a small U.S. embassy-based force at Kabul before leaving office. Under the new plan, troops will be drawn down to 5,500 in 2017 and based at 4 locations: Kabul, Bagram, Jalalabad, and Kandahar. The decision follows months of discussions between the U.S. and Afghanistan's leaders on how to best support Afghan forces. U.S. troops will continue training and advising Afghan security personnel. However, they will not be engaged in combat missions. Obama's foreign policy has become an issue among candidates running for the White House in the November 2016 election. Whichever candidate takes over the Oval Office will once again have to reassess to what extent the U.S. should still be in Afghanistan 14 years after first entering.
So, Barbara, what are we seeing in Afghanistan? A new U.S. policy or a lack of policy?
Well, listen, we have to put this in perspective. And President Obama, when he was running for re-election in 2008, and even prior to that, he made the distinction always between Iraq, which is a war of choice, as he defined it, and Afghanistan, which is a war of necessity. And policy, as you well know, Alon, is a living, breathing, dynamic process, and it needs mid-course corrections occasionally. So I think that this reversal of policy, of not pulling out before the end of his term, of leaving a very minor force of troops, 5,500 troops by the end of 2017. But don't forget that there are tens of thousands of U.S. contractors on the ground in Afghanistan. And so all in all, with the very modest goals of stabilizing the country, preventing further gains of Taliban and al-Qaeda and Islamic forces in Iraq, I think that this could be doable, and it is prudent on the part of the president to respond to the fluidity of events.
So this decision, Barak, is just maintaining the bare necessities?
The very fact that that Obama is withdrawing down to 5,500 ultimately, that's below half the amount that his military advisors have advised. So despite the fluidity on the ground, that number is not going to be able to serve as a stabilizing force. So on one hand, there's no way that the United States can bring in a huge number of troops in order to develop infrastructure when you have such a deficit in the country. You don't have a defense minister, you don't have chain of command, you have multiple generals coming up with conflicting agendas in a single district. The problem remains that you're not going to be able to prevent Afghanistan from totally collapsing with such a limited number of force, which would be the minimum objective that one would have.
So when we look at the map of Afghanistan, which is becoming more and more filled with those spots of Taliban-controlled areas, would that be sufficient to change the momentum there?
Well, you also have to keep in mind that in addition to the troops and the tens of thousands of contractors that I mentioned, there is this element, people tend to disparage this element, but there is this element of smart power. And under the new president and the unity government, corruption is down. Yes, the radicalism is on the rise, but there is a chance that through this combination of troops, contractors, smart power, that they can keep a control of the mission, which is ultimately just to stabilize.
With this reduction of troops, however, what you also see is a vacuum of governance, prompting outside actors such as Iran to sponsor the Taliban, to provide them both logistical and material support to counter ISIS that they identify as a greater threat. There's also regional implications, because when you look at the fact that the Taliban is taking over districts that are bordering Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Iran, China, Pakistan, you're seeing outside forces deploying troops to the border in order to prevent, perhaps even to go further into into Afghanistan to fill that void.
What's breeding a lot of this radicalism has been this incessant air-only campaign, the drone strikes, the air campaign. The attack on the hospital was just the last straw. So again, you don't need necessarily huge amount of military might, but you need lack of corruption, you need chain of command, which remains to be seen, but there is a possibility that it can be reconstituted. And it's interesting that former President Karzai gave an interview just yesterday to the Russian RT network, where he basically blamed the U.S. for this increase in radicalism, the most ever since 2001, and he invited the Russians back in, and why not the Chinese and the Indian join in as well? So, I mean, that's so hypocritical on the part of Karzai when, in fact, refusing to sign a status of forces agreement, and but it remains to be seen.
All right, stay with me, please, for the next subject.
Sure.
The nuclear deal signed with Iran this past July is bringing major changes to the Middle East, from the strengthened Iranian proxies to new regional alliances. Alongside, there is a growing appetite for arms in the Gulf states. More in the next report.
On July 14th of this year, all eyes were on the historic nuclear deal inked between Iran and the P5+1 world powers. But behind the scenes, other deals are being made, all becoming part of the future Middle East. Just days after the announcement this summer, leaders were quick to flock to the Gulf to try and soften the blow. U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter sat down with Saudi King Salman in Jeddah, soon followed by EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini in her first visit to the kingdom. By September, U.S. President Barack Obama hosted the Saudi king in the White House and discussed fast-tracking the provision of certain military equipment to the kingdom, as well as heightened cooperation on counterterrorism and ballistic missile defense. A host of new alliances are also being forged amongst opponents of the deal. A report from the British Sky News this week claimed Israel is in negotiations with several Gulf states over a purchase of its Iron Dome missile defense system. Israel is known to refuse selling high-tech weaponry to countries it doesn't have diplomatic ties with. But amid the international thaw in ties with Iran, a closening between the Jewish state and the Gulf isn't far-fetched. The report did receive a boost from Khalid bin Mohammed Al Khalifa, Bahrain's Minister of Foreign Affairs, during a visit to London this week.
The Israelis have their small Iron Dome. The Gulf Cooperation Council will have a much bigger one.
Kuwait, for its part, denied the report. Contacted by I24 News, the company Rafael, which develops the Iron Dome system, denied any knowledge of contracts to be signed with the Gulf, but stopped short of refuting that contracts may have been signed in the past.
So, Barak, what does the Gulf states want? Preparing for a real conflict with Iran, or just deterrence?
Look, due to the Iranian deal, they're feeling incredibly vulnerable. Therefore, just right after the deal, President Obama invited GCC representatives to Camp David in order to reassure them. And part of that reassurance was to create a regional missile defense system that the United States would review. And it's constantly fallen short in the past. The context to, though, have increased militarism in the Gulf is the fact that Iran has got the nuclear status practically.
And recognized.
You have then the UAE ambassador in Washington calling up the head of a defense and security committee saying, if your worst enemy can achieve a nuclear status, then so can we. You have Saudi Arabia also seeking to do a shopping spree for nuclear materials with Pakistan. You have at the same time sub-state actors like ISIS trying to exploit sectarian divisions, whether it be in Kuwait, where there's a sizable Shia population, same in Bahrain, as well as in Saudi Arabia. And when there was an attack in Kuwait just a month ago or 2 months ago, you saw immediately security tightened across the region from the UAE to Qatar. So that tremendous vulnerability. You've also got a number of domestic individuals from these states going to fight alongside ISIS and returning back. So there is naturally going to be an accompanying shopping spree with that.
And a report on the interest in the Israeli Iron Dome?
The reports are bogus on the Israeli component at the moment. They are indeed talking. There will be another GCC Missile Defense Command meeting in November, and they are looking to perhaps some kind of a hybrid joint development system. But keep in mind, UAE is getting the THAAD, which is much higher, comparable to the Arrow, higher than the Patriot PAC-3, which the Saudis and the Kuwaitis have. Qatar also wants to get the THAAD, although they haven't signed anything. But one thing I'd like to mention, and the missile defense umbrella, this GCC six-state umbrella command, has been talked about for 10 years or more. What is driving this is indeed the Iranian threat, as Barak mentioned, but I would focus on the conventional arms shopping spree, because that indeed is happening, and not only because of Iran, and not only because of lack of commitment about the U.S. and the reassurance that they have from the U.S. staying power in the region, but also don't forget the war in Yemen. They're pouring hardware into that region, and they need to replenish their stocks and buy more. So
it'll be interesting to follow where would Iran go next. Thank you very much, Barbara Opall, Barak. That's all we have time for tonight. Be sure to visit us again next week for another edition of I24 News Defense. For all the latest headlines, log on to www.i24news.tv. Have a safe night from the Jaffa Port.